So I pretty much dodged a massive bullet when it comes to my professional career. And after seeing all the news of the game layoffs this year, I was particularly upset to see that it hit Bungie. The same Bungie that, by the way, got a massive influx of cash last year when Sony paid over $3 billion to pick them up. And while the terms of that contract are a little odd, like the fact that Bungie can still release games to the competition of PlayStation, being Xbox and I guess Nintendo Switch and PC to some extent. While that agreement is weird, I did get some insight into what Bungie's original thought process was during my series of job interviews with them last year. And I got to say, I dodged a huge bullet because I guarantee you that I would have been laid off with everyone else. And while my heart does go out to everybody that did get laid off, and it totally sucks, speaking from experience, by the way, of somebody who's been laid off, not once, but twice, I can honestly say that none of this surprises me based on how inconsistent Bungie was during their job interview with me. And now that I've kind of seen the result of that, and I've seen where the position that I was going to do most likely was deleted, and that Bungie wasn't really clear on how the takeover / acquisition / merging between them and Sony was going to work out, I think it's safe to say that the mass amount of layoffs directly relates to some of my hesitancy during the numerous interviews I had. So I was potentially going to be hired to work policies and procedures, which, trust me, I know sounds insanely boring. I wanted to get my foot into the video game sector. I was potentially thinking of a massive career change, which I think I did a pretty big one. I went from engineering to program management ultimately. This position would have been a lead engineer position at Bungie, and the job description was for policies and standards, which shockingly, I know a lot about just through osmosis of doing my job for years and years as a software lead, understanding things like configuration management and the agile development process and how to document and set goals and reach goals and schedules and timelines and all that kind of stuff. I'm very clear on that. So I thought this was a shoo-in, and I was like, great, I could go work for Bungie. Bungie just got out by Sony, so in theory, I work for Sony now. I get my foot in the door for game development, and maybe ultimately I can pivot this experience at some point into my real goal of going to work on Halo. So win-win-win, right? It was anything but that. The interview and the interviews, I should say, were very different than what the position description was detailed for. And while they had initially told me the position would be for me to come over and to help adopt Sony's engineering processes into Bungie's, because Bungie, and very admittedly too, to me, who was a nobody who just interviewed, it wasn't like I was getting any sort of trade secrets. And while I did have to sign an NDA on some of the really dopey questions they asked me, trust me, they weren't even that great. While I had to sign an NDA on that, they were very open with me on the fact that their internal processes weren't all that great, and that they kind of struggled and had a difficult time when it came to agile software development, particularly in the documentation sector, which is where I have a pretty good specialty in helping out. And it really boiled down to absorbing policies and procedures from one group of people to another, basically giving them form and structure on future development that they would do. And I'm like, okay, you know what? This sounds awesome. Sign me up. I can do this now. Let's go. Going through the interview process, the position began to morph over and over. As every interviewer I went to, the explanation and the understanding of what the position would ultimately entail began to change. It ultimately culminated in a thing they called the loop. And the loop was an 8-hour interview process in which I was passed across, I don't even remember now, it was a year ago. It was like 5 or 6 different people. And each of them had a different specialty, so to speak to me about. whether it was about conflict resolution or whether it was about honesty or my general experience with gaming or anything like that. And every time before the interview process began, the person would introduce themselves to me. We would chat for a little bit, and ultimately they would tell me that this is what the position will be for. And it kept changing. And I kept asking them, like, well, I was told the position was actually more for documentation. And they said, well, yeah, that's part of it, but there's also a little bit of HR involved. Well, there's also a little bit of software coding involved, where there's a little bit of program management involved. And it really became clear to me, I don't think they knew what they wanted. In hindsight, it's very clear to me that they were just trying to fill bodies and seats, the butts and seats kind of phrase. Like, we don't really know the help we need. We just know that we need help. So why don't you come over? We'll hire you. We'll put you in a position where you can kind of just do stuff, and we'll start to, through osmosis, figure out kind of your strengths and your weaknesses and figure out where you belong. And I could tell you that as a professional now for many, many, many years, that is absolutely the wrong way to go about hiring quality candidates for a specific task or series of tasks when you don't do a good job of vetting them. Ultimately, it didn't work out for them and me in terms of we just couldn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. And I decided it was best to go do something else, which I am absolutely thrilled about my current position. I love it. And I am ecstatic I went down that route. I met some phenomenal people, and I'm having an absolute blast. And this could be my forever home, and I want it to be my forever home. And I think my dream of game being paid to work on games, even if I'm not directly related in the storytelling or the art, just being part of the engineering machine, I think those dreams ended with this series of interviews. So when I see that Bungie just did a massive layoff, it makes me kind of think, well, yes, one, I did dodge a huge bullet, but two, it kind of makes sense based on the little bit I was involved with what they were doing. And they were really struggling with how to document something. Everything that they told me really revolved around the fact that they had a hard time organizing people, thoughts, and ideas and rallying them into a single cause. The original position description, I think, would have helped this at least from a procedural standpoint. Maybe not so much from an administrative standpoint, because it was not a supervisory position. Although I would have gladly taken on a supervisory position to manage people, because it's kind of hard to write documentation for like one group of people, but then not forcing them to do it. That dotted line management, something a lot of us deal with, where you are assigned a matrix of people or a cross organization of people. And ultimately, you don't have final say in a lot of things of how they do with leave, or final say on how you do a lot of things with their time off or their performance or anything like that. You're just giving them taskers. So that was a big red flag for me already, because I was like, wait a minute, I'm going to basically be giving engineering direction to people, but I can't enforce them to use it. No, that's not your job. And that's the kind of things that started to raise more red flags with me. Well, the fact that Bungie has been in the gaming business for as long as they have, and they're still struggling to figure out what their own engineering practices are, was the biggest red flag. Not the fact that they had a set of standards and Sony had a set of standards, and it was my job to morph the two into one. More so, it was making a herd of cats into a nice straight line. When I asked them about if they use software development folders, and I asked them about some of their engineering practices and their entry and exit criteria and some of their internal test events and the wickets that they did to ensure that a product was being completed on time with a set known of expectations. And by the way, this is engineering 101, guys. This isn't anything fancy. They couldn't do it. And it wasn't like they couldn't do it because they didn't want to talk to me about it because I was an outsider. They couldn't do it because they didn't know it. I went very high up in the organization. This position reported directly to their lead engineer. And I talked with him, and even he was struggling to tell me exactly what the policies and the procedures were going to be. All they knew is that when Sony was coming to town, it was going to be my job to take those things and make Bungie do them. And by doing that, obviously finding, some kind of transition plans and how to make, baby steps that feed into larger steps creating a schedule that kind of walked through that process. Because you're not just going to overnight change the way you do engineering. And I understand that. But it was very clear to me that they were struggling so bad, they didn't even know what they needed help with. And during my interview, I got a little more brazen and I told them towards the end, like, listen, this is a lot taller task than I think you guys realize it is. I will gladly take this position on. It sounds like a fun challenge, again, with my kind of ulterior motive of getting my foot into the video game sector and, potentially moving on to, 343 at some point and going to work on Halo, which was my dream. Still is my dream, but I know it's not going to happen now. But going through that thought process with them, it was clear to me they didn't understand it. And I think that's partially why the position changed a little bit, but it changed more into a human, when they kind of realized what my skill set was, it changed more into like a human resources type position, which I wasn't interested in doing. I wasn't interested in doing onboarding with people and invoicing of training procedures and policies. And the position started to slowly morph into that. Needless to say, during my debrief, which, not getting the job, and I did request a debrief, and they were actually willing to comply with me, which was really nice because they don't owe me anything. I told them very candidly, I think you guys are in big trouble, not because I'm bitter and it didn't work out. I said, but I think you're in big trouble because you really don't know what you don't know. And that worries me that for you guys, and I'm not stupid. I know you're working on Destiny 3. I didn't know that Marathon at the time, but I know they're working on other projects. And I know Sony is going to task them with creating original experiences and fun new things because Sony didn't just buy Bungie for the fun of it, right? I said, you guys are going to really struggle because that creative spark of everything just magically coming together and creating the perfect product is a once in a lifetime thing. It doesn't happen over and over again. And look at any other major game studio who has struck lightning. Look at how they follow on with sequels if it's clear they didn't know what they were doing. Say what you will about Call of Duty, say whether you love it or hate it or whatever, it's a very methodical, defined development process. And you know what? It's the best-selling game every single year. And they put out a known quality product with distinct events, distinct live service goals, and it runs on a very tight machine. I guarantee you their development process for software is probably bigger than the tax code because they're very meticulous on what they do. And it's netted them very fantastic financial results. Bungie wasn't that way. Bungie was definitely in a much worse place. And I told them that during my debrief that I wish them well, but I'm worried. I don't think you guys are going to be successful if you don't take this more seriously. The position that I applied for was given to somebody else with the caveat it wasn't the original position that I applied for. As I said, the process changed over time. It morphed over time. It got away from the standards and policies and procedures and development and good business practices and morphed more into this hybrid human resources, kind of weird team lead, supervisory but not supervisory role. I probably would have been miserable in it, and most likely I would have been terminated like everybody else was just a few short days ago. So I'm not sad about how it didn't work out. And like I said, for me personally, it worked out very well. But seeing all these massive layoffs, seeing how bad Lightfall was, seeing that there was a lot of story threads that didn't make sense, seeing as a lot of issues arrived with the game mechanics not really matching up between the single player experience and the multiplayer experience, and these grandiose visions that were never realized, all boil back to system validation and system verification. The infamous software engineering V model, definitely something that I would have addressed absolutely to make sure that product is actually tested against the known metric so that you can actually validate whether the work was done properly or not. I can tell you that that was most certainly not done, and that is probably one of the reasons why Lightfall suffered so many inconsistencies, because nobody went back to make sure that it fit into the larger system master plan or the system engineering approach or anything like that. It's very clear to me. As a direct result of them being so unorganized and hoping that that Bungie magic, for lack of a better word, would just ultimately culminate into something phenomenal in the 11th hour was definitely a long shot dream. Definitely something that I knew would not happen again, and it didn't happen again. And it directly culminated in Sony being pissed because they spent a ton of dough in a studio who frankly shit the bed and released a sub-quality product that hurt their player numbers in an already demanding, very aggressive game space. 2023, arguably one of the best gaming years in a long time. The list of Game of the Year contenders and candidates is insurmountable at this point. And frankly, I don't know how a panel of people is going to choose just one, because there have been some phenomenal games. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Destiny 2 is not even remotely included on that list. The culmination of what was a very long project, wrapping up this DLC, setting the framework for the final piece, story beats missing, gameplay elements missing, systems not fleshed out properly, directly relates back to exactly what they initially said they needed help with doing. And they didn't get it, especially for me, obviously, because they didn't hire me. But I will say in closing, this is absolutely expected. And this is what happens when you throw good money over bad, over good, and you continue to throw funding at a project, but you don't have a clear, concise vision on how it's meant to be built. I'm not talking about story. I'm not talking about graphics. I'm talking about the approach of, we are going to make a game. These are our objectives. Here is how we are going to track success. Here is how we're going to track failure. Here are key milestones to determine if we are absolutely progressing in a logical manner or not. None of that was done. None of this was done. Clearly, they did not fill that position. They told me, just some nobody off the street who has a really strong background in this, that they needed help. That's how readily apparent this is to the world. They needed help. And given an opportunity to hire me or somebody like me, I am not God's gift to engineering. I'm not even an engineer anymore. But given the opportunity they had to hire somebody to fill this position, they began to waffle on what the position was, and ultimately they let go of at least 100 talented people who are now actively searching for jobs because Bungie let them down, because Bungie did not do the right thing and hire people to give them a creative vision or creative guidance. But most importantly, from my perspective, did not hire somebody to help give them structure to ensure success. And that's sad and disappointing, because this could have been prevented had there been more rigor that went into the design process. Had I had a better one-on-one with the head of engineering at the end of all of this. And he's a very famous person. He is all over social media. He's all over keynotes. Just Google him. You will see him. I talked with him at length for over an hour during my debrief. And I told him all of this, and he shrugged and said that wasn't a goal and they were going to be fine. Well, guess what? I hate to be right and hate to be I told you so, but considering you laid off 10% of your workforce, you're clearly not in the best place you should be. And that's sad. And I feel bad. And I hope that maybe now, after all this is done, they will reassess and realize that, maybe that role is a little bit more pivotal than we thought, or maybe we need to go back and recalibrate. Clearly, that's going to come via delay. They're going to delay the next expansion, the final shape. They're going to delay that because they're going to have to figure out what they want to do. But I can be very clear with you. If they do not clean up their policies and practices, I can guarantee the next expansion is going to be just as broken and just as disappointing to fans as this one was. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. And until next time, I will see you guys on the other side.